To all of our viewing participants today, I greet you all, and I want to remind you that in terms of what we're trying to do, it's not just the national effort here, it's an international effort. We are organizing ourselves in unity in the United States, it's true, but not just for our purposes only. We're doing it for the entire slavery diaspora. And I never knew as a child how my destiny was being shaped for future things that I was to do. It just so happened I lost my parents at a young age. And because I was the girlfriend of Akbar Muhammad, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad took me under his wing and treated me as if I was already a daughter-in-law. Now, we hadn't married yet, but that's the way he was with me. And I really appreciate all of the love and teachings I got from him while still a teenager. One of the incidents after we did marry, that's Akbar and I, was an incident that occurred in New York City. I don't know what was going on. I don't think we ever knew. But the Jewish people had blocked the boats that came in from Egypt and would not allow them to unload their wares. So they went to Malcolm X and they asked him to help them in this situation. He did. He closed down Harlem for a while. And with that kind of pressure on them, all of a sudden, the Egyptians were allowed to unload their wares. From that developed an idea by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X to put together some kind of unity agreement between us as a people so that we would get to know each other better. So my husband at that time, Akbar Muhammad, and I were asked to move to Cairo, Egypt as cultural attachés between the Muslims in the United States and the Egyptian government. And at that time, it was known as the Jumhuriyat al-Arabiyyat al-Muttahida. And as that, we served about 2 or 3 years. It was a good start. I didn't know it was preparing me for the future, but during that time, I was able to learn how to act as a cultural attaché on an international setting. Later, as my husband, the Honorable Elijah Silas Muhammad, mentioned to you earlier, I was asked by him to approach the United Nations and connect with the United Nations. Now, I did not know anything about the UN. I had been prepared for law, and that's not really part of our legal training, is to be involved in international law. So everything that I was to learn about international law, I had to do by being over there. So my husband, Silas Muhammad, sent me to Geneva for that kind of training. I didn't know up from down about the United Nations, but I did learn. I worked under the auspices of Dr. Joseph Cly. Some of you might have known him. And then I also worked under an NGO status. That's one of the things you have to be heard over there, called CURE, Caucasians United for Reparations and Emancipation. That was later changed to All for Reparations and Emancipation. Now, what does that do for you over there? It gives you the right to have consultative status. And as such, with consultative status, you're allowed to speak and be heard before the working groups and before the council in the United Nations. And once we got this status and we learned how to lobby and how it's done, it was interesting because they put me under the guidance of a he was a Dutch attorney at the time. And he told me, Harriet, if you want people to take you seriously in the United Nations, you are going to have to continue to deliver your cause for 7 years nonstop. If you don't do that, no one's going to pay you any attention. So I said, well, all right, that's something we can do. And we got started on that. Sometimes I was under Dr. Clyde's NGO status as Iram. And when we got started, I was under Cure's NGO status. But we got into the mechanism of the United Nations and how it works. And my husband had thrown me out there, and we got everything set up for him. And he made his first intervention, that's what they're called, in 1997. What he did at that point in time is point out to the United Nations that with their international covenants on civil and political rights, Article 27, they had basically left all of those of us who were part of the slavery diaspora without any human rights protection or recognition. And they paused, they looked at him like, what are you talking about? So he began to explain to them. And Article 27, so that you'll know, says in those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right, in community with the other members of their group, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. He pointed out to them how they were in error in that human rights law, because during slavery, all of that had been deliberately and systematically wiped out with all of those of us who were slaves. This was not wanted by the slave master. It had no meaning to them, and it was not recognized. Our culture, our language, our mother tongue was all deliberately and systematically destroyed. So if it was destroyed, then how can we have what you consider to be something that all nations on the earth have, human rights? He pointed out to them that we don't have human rights to be protected. So what are you going to do for us, since one of your bragging posts to the world is that you are for human rights for everyone, everywhere? So this surprised them. It caught them off guard. They obviously had not thought about it, but they did see the reality of it. And there was Professor Mahedi at the time that was part of the working group. He was so astonished by this revelation from Silas Muhammad until he got up from his seating position. It was a large auditorium also. And he took the time to walk back all the way to where we were sitting at the time. And he shook his hand and thanked him for pointing that out. Another working group leader that pointed that out was Professor Ide from one of the European nations. I think he was from Norway. And he pointed that out also. And he said, we now have to find out how and where you fit. And that is something that the United Nations, for the first time, started doing because they had never thought about it before, because we as Blacks had never complained about it before. They thought we were happy being right under the Caucasians in whatever countries we were located in. And we did learn from the United Nations that they deal with problems that are similarly situated. So what they did after that point in time is include in their standing agenda the lingering effects of plantation slavery. And this continued for years. It gave us the right, the legal right, to be heard every single time that we had a meeting. My husband, Silas Muhammad, also pointed out to them that because of the way slavery was done throughout the diaspora, we needed interpreters. We as Black people could not even talk to each other. Think about that. We couldn't get together and talk about our common problems. So he asked them to give us seminars and give us interpreters. What do you mean interpreters? Well, remember what the situation was in that time and then. The Brazilians, who was the largest number of people in the African diaspora, they were over 70 million then, way outnumbered us in the United States. They were comfortable with Portuguese. Then you had all of the Afro-descendant people throughout South America, and they were comfortable with Spanish. And then there were the rest of us, a smaller number in the United States and in Canada, who were comfortable with English. So he asked them, give us interpreters in at least those three languages so that we can communicate with each other. And they said, all right, you have a point there. We will certainly start working on that. And they did. And I'm telling you about this because this is the history of the Afro-descendant name. First, we met in a palace. I think it was the Woodrow Wilson Palace they had there in Geneva. Then we met up in Montreal, Canada. Then we had another meeting in La Ceiba, Honduras. Again, keep in mind, these were countries, these were seminars that were set up under the auspices and protection of the United Nations. And this is one of the things the Honorable Silas Muhammad had asked them to do. And they did follow through with that. We say protection because in some countries in which we met, trying to have a meeting even, if you were representing the United Nations or attached to the United Nations in any way, meant you might be kidnapped. So when we got off planes in the different countries, we had to be met with machine gun security guards for protection. We did that. In La Ceiba, Honduras, we were there about a month, about a week. And the name came up because the big deal was, and still is, how are we going to be recognized? As far as the United Nations is concerned, you have to be represented as a nation or a people. So, and we have been encouraged to be represented as people. So as peoples, we needed a name. We debated, we talked about it for a whole week. Those of us who are from the United States, we had been taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad that we were lost, found people. We discussed that in La Ceiba. That did not sit well with too many of the people that were there. Also, we discussed other names, and most of the South Americans in the slavery diaspora had been using Afrodescendants. They were comfortable with it. They understood it. And that's the name they wanted to use. So after a week of discussion about it, we took a vote. And I want you to know this, those of you who are leaders in the United States, that this Afrodescendant name was not forced down anyone's throats. It was one of the first times in history where we as Black people were allowed to name ourselves. We took a vote on the name, and we decided to be known as Afrodescendants. This was done by representatives selected by the United Nations from at least 19 countries that were part of the slavery diaspora. Remember that, our people here in the United States, because this is not one of those situations where the white man is forcing a name on you. This is something that we did as Black people with their protection, and we decided on the name Afrodescendants. It was discussed by Brazil, who was uncomfortable with the Portuguese, that they wanted to add something. So a discussion was taking place, and most of this came under the guidance of Professor Jose Bengoa from Santiago, Chile. When we met in La Ceiba, Honduras, brought that up. Then we went on to another country, Chincha, Peru. Another entity picked by the United Nations because it had something to do with the slavery diaspora. That's something, I've been told to wrap it up. The time is up. But let me pass this on right quickly. Our people have been forced to dig an 11-mile-long tunnel underground into a hacienda in Chincha, Peru. That's why they chose that place. But there we finished up more of our meetings. We discussed a definition, and everything was going along too smoothly, I guess, because that was our last meeting. After that, the United Nations closed down the Human Rights Department and opened it up with a council. Now, why did they do that? And with that, I'll pause and we can get back to other things. Thank you.